Welcome to the final spring session of our 4th annual Religions and the Practice of Peace Colloquium Series. I'm David Hempton, the Dean of the Harvard Divinity School. So thank you all for joining us tonight for this very, very special event. I'd like to begin by extending gratitude and a warm welcome on behalf of us all to our featured guest, Ben Ferencz, for being with us tonight. We're tremendously grateful. Actually, this is a rather strange story. I hadn't seen Ben for about a year and bumped into him in Grand Central Station on Monday. He was on his way to the UN, and I was on my way back from supporting a film that the Divinity School has been involved with at Notre-Dame-Dunblane, which is about school shootings in Dunblane and Newtown, Connecticut, which is a great little documentary film which won the best documentary award at the Tribeca Film Festival in New York City. So anyway, Ben guided me to the proper platform. You could see that I was an Irishman lost in a big city, and was very kind to me. So we appreciate, Ben, you traveling to Cambridge to engage with us in this important and timely conversation. It's a long-awaited moment and a great honor to have you with us. I really appreciate you making the effort. We'd also like to extend our thanks to tonight's respondents, Professor Gabriella Blum of Harvard Law School, and Professor Bryan Hehir, once Dean of the Divinity School, now at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, for also joining us to share their expertise. Also very grateful to Federica D'Alessandra, who has been instrumental in conceiving and planning tonight's session, and to our co-sponsor of the program on negotiation at Harvard Law School. As always, we'd also like to express our appreciation to RPP's generous supporters, including Karen Budney, who's with us this evening, for helping to make these and other RPP events possible. And I'd like to thank all our RPP staff and graduate assistants for really tremendous work in organizing these events. So thank you, all of you. So our topic tonight is sustaining peace, the role of ethics, law, and policy in promoting a new international security paradigm. Throughout this academic year, we've been in conversation with colleagues across Harvard University in connection with our Emerging Sustainable Peace Initiative, the SPI, to foster leadership, collaboration, and creativity for a more humane, harmonious, and equitable world. In a Sustainable Peace Working Group, our graduate students have been eliciting the perspectives of fellow students, faculty, staff, and alums from diverse backgrounds and disciplines, and have been expanding this inquiry to community members from the public. We're asking big questions. What will it take to make peace and our human family substantive, shared, and sustainable? What are the multiple dimensions of violence and peace that we must take into account, from the institutional and structural to the spiritual, ethical, and cultural? How can we develop approaches that are proactive and holistic enough to prevent and transform destructive conflict in ways that address its complex interrelationship with humanity's other big problems, from social and economic inequality to environmental degradation? So how can we mainstream sustainable peace as an integral goal of leadership across sectors? What changes in leadership preparation at our universities can help us advance such a trend? So these are big questions, and we're delighted to have Ben Ferencz with us to help us think about these urgent issues. He's been thinking about these things for over half a century. He's a very distinguished and inspirational person to help us along. A graduate of Harvard Law School, a longtime friend of Harvard Divinity School, a place where he was fed during his law school career, he told me. They can't afford it at the law school. A longtime friend of our school, and he was the chief prosecutor for the Nüremberg trials. He's been a pioneering contributor to international law and its institutions over the past century, a lifelong advocate for his favorite phrase, law, not war. He's a prolific author on all of these subjects. Among the attributes that make Mr. Ferencz's tireless advocacy for peace so compelling is that he brings to it a combination of hopeful optimism and stark realism, grounded in deep knowledge of the power and promise of the rule of law, as well as first-hand experience with the most atrocious cases of war and inhumanity as a US soldier in Europe during World War II, a liberator of the Nazi concentration camps, and an investigator of that unspeakable genocide and other mass crimes against humanity. He also brings a historical perspective that balances a keen awareness of the deficiencies in the current state of our international legal tools and institutions, with an appreciation for the great strides that the international community has made in developing them to date. He brings a practical vision for reforming them and strengthening their effectiveness, and even while understanding the magnitude of these challenges, he carries a faith in the potential of compassionate and committed individuals, including our young people, to work out ways to protect and share life on this planet more sanely, more humanely for present and future generations. So we're so pleased to have you. I'm also delighted now to introduce our moderator tonight, Federica D'Alessandra, whom we've been fortunate to have this year as a visiting fellow at Harvard Divinity School, an advisor to the Religions and the Practice of Peace program, and an active contributor to our Sustainable Peace initiative. Federica is a leading international law and public policy scholar, working on issues of national and international security, foreign policy, international law, and diplomacy. Prior to her appointment at HDS, she has been affiliated with the Harvard Law School as a visiting scholar, researcher, the Harvard Kennedy School as an associate, and later as a fellow. She often counsels and advises governments and international organizations on war crimes prosecutions and atrocity prevention, as well as on United Nations reform and peacekeeping efforts. Forbes recognized her in 2017 as one of 30 under 30 most influential European thinkers on law and policy. In recognition of her work and advocacy, she's received the William Reese Smith Jr. Outstanding Young Lawyer of the Year Award from LexisNexis and the International Bar Association. In 2017, she was named Italian of the Year by the Italian Journalist Agency. I voted for you. So Federica, thanks so much for being here, and over to you to moderate tonight's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean Empton, for that very kind and generous introduction, and also for your gracious hospitality here at the Divinity School. Before I start, I wanted to thank Liz, Laura, Andrea, and everyone else at the Divinity School who's worked hard to make tonight's discussion a possibility. I would like to start by saying that for me to be at the Divinity School at a time where you're thinking through questions of sustaining peace and what it means and what it entails has been an enormous privilege. First and foremost, as someone who's dedicated to specialize on international law and policy of peace and security, including prevention and response to mass atrocities, I'm driven and I subscribe very much to SPI's core objectives. SPI's goal of reducing destructive conflict, preventing violence, and fostering flourishing for all is indeed the very rationale upon which the body of laws that regulate my work have been developed and conceived. The reduction of conflict and of its devastating impacts is very much what underpins the law of armed conflict, and the bettering of the human condition is very much what underpins international human rights law. What's been particularly refreshing about being with SPI this year is also that by virtue of SPI's search for a holistic and comprehensive solution and approach to peace, that's also forced me in many ways to get out of the trenches of international law and policy and to confront myself with people that approach problems and thinking about solutions in ways that are much different than what lawyers and policymakers normally do. So that, to me, has been extremely enriching as an experience. And so that has helped me to take a step back and start thinking in terms of bigger picture. And for people with my background, part of what thinking in terms of a bigger picture entails is asking, why is it that with so many laws and so many institutions and so many dedicated people that are in place and work day and night to make sure that conflict is reduced and that we reduce human suffering and we promote human flourishing, we continue to be confronted with violence and human suffering. Now, some thinkers within this very academic community, like Professor Steven Pinker over at the Department of Psychology, will tell you that the world is in a much better place today than it's ever been. That if you look at aggregate data, today way less people die to violent conflict, for example, than ever before in human history. In his most recent book, he went one step beyond that and said, actually, if you look at all significant measures, humans are making progress. And indeed, he argues that we're witnessing a humanitarian revolution that places life and happiness at the center of values and that uses reason and evidence to design response to new challenges. And I like to believe this. Yet, I'm thoroughly aware that this humanitarian revolution is utterly slow and incomplete, and that the performance of the very institutions connected with this humanitarian revolution has been underwhelming at best, when not wholly inadequate. For example, I'm aware that one of the institutions that is the most dear to me because of what it represents has not fulfilled its promise to humanity. The United Nations was set up in the aftermath of World War II to save future generations from the scourge of war by maintaining and enforcing international peace and security, promoting human rights, and promoting development. Yet, over 70 years after the UN was established, the world remains rife with conflict, human rights are constantly under siege, and the prosperity brought by economic development has not been fairly distributed. And while it is true that today less people die to violence than at any other time in human history, a recent UN and World Bank joint report called Pathways for Peace reveals that for the first time since the end of World War II, in 2010, the number of major conflicts worldwide has tripled. Fighting in a growing number of low-intensity conflicts has escalated. The same report reveals that in 2016 alone, for the first time in over 30 years, the number of countries that experience violent conflict has grown, and albeit much of this violence remains entrenched in low-income countries, some of today's deadliest conflicts, in fact, are occurring in countries that have higher income levels and, most importantly, stronger institutions. Also, the same report tells us that more and more conflicts today are internationalized, and that is because countries continue to intervene in other countries' internal conflicts. Now, the problem of war and the violence that it follows it is not certainly a new problem. To the contrary, throughout history, war has been the standard and default way of conducting international politics, and paradoxically, of enforcing international peace. That was until in 1929, a group of visionaries that Yale professors Hune Hathaway and Scott Shapiro have recently called the Internationalists in their book, came together to sign the Colloquium Pact, through which war was repudiated as an instrument of foreign policy, and a vision for a new world order was laid out. A new world order, they argue, so radically different from the old world order that it will become the exact photo negative of that world order, where states no longer have the right to conquer other states, waging aggressive war is a grave crime, gun diplomacy is no longer legitimate, and economic sanctions are not only legal, but the standard ways in which international law is enforced. Now, of course, the Colloquium Pact did not stop war. As a matter of fact, within a few years, World War II broke out. So why am I telling you this? Well, because in my opinion, and in the opinion of many, what the Colloquium did was to change the intellectual conversation about war. And what they succeeded in do was to change not just the normative paradigm of what should be and could be considered normal or even ideal. These internationalists that I'm talking about are what Professor Cass Sunstein from the law school in 1996 defined norm entrepreneurs. That is a category of people who are interested in changing societal norms And if they're successful in their endeavors, they can produce norm bandwagons or norm cascades that lead to substantial changes in the normative course of history. How that occurs can be explained through the work of other two professors, one of whom is actually at the Kennedy School, Professor Catherine Sinking, and her co-author, Professor Martha Fenmore. In 1997, they postulated what they called the life cycle of a norm, which is, in a very much simplified way, kind of goes this way. First, we have the emergence of a norm, when norm entrepreneurs arise with a conviction that something must be changed. These norm entrepreneurs use existing organizations and norms as platforms to socialize and proselytize this new idea, framing their issue to reach a broader audience. In this phase, some states will adopt the norm because maybe it reflects their ideals. Maybe they're compelled to do it by their domestic constituencies. And eventually, enough states will adopt this norm, or enough constituencies will adopt this norm, that then a tipping point is reached, and then the norm cascades, and other states that didn't want to join in the first place are compelled to join because they succumb to, among other things, international pressure to do it. And over time, the norm is internalized, professionals press for codification and universal adherence, and eventually conformity becomes so natural that we cease to even notice the presence of the norm. And this leads me to my second point. The challenge of our generation, in my opinion, is not to stop war as an instrument of foreign policy. Wars among countries still occur, and powerful countries that want to go to war will do so no matter what. But that is not because the norm isn't there. That is because we haven't raised the cost, we as domestic constituencies, but also as the international community, we haven't raised the cost of contravening to that prohibition against the use of force. And that obviously is a challenge that we should confront, but that's not by far, in my opinion, the biggest challenge. The biggest challenge of our generation is to confront what Professors Gabriella Blum, who's here with us tonight, and Professor Jennifer Walsh have called the individualization of war, which means how do you address the root causes of violence across the board before they escalate to full-blown conflict? How do you address individual grievances before they're brought to the battlefield? And how do you contain militaristic responses to the problems caused by the ever-increasing global interdependence? This is why I believe we need to engage in new thinking. And it is against this background that what I see this community do here at HDS with the Sustaining Peace Initiative is incredibly appealing and refreshing. Engaging in new thinking to reduce destructive conflict, prevent violence, and foster flourishing of all is exactly what a leading academic institution like Harvard should be doing. I'm encouraged to say that we're not by far the only ones who are thinking in these terms, and maybe I will ask all of you if you might think that we might be witnessing a new intellectual trend. Why do I say that? The United Nations itself, for example, in response to the same disturbing trends I described, and of course in response to their own failures, have launched a parallel conversation which has actually developed separately from this conversation, but very organically in terms of what the questions are that they're looking at, in terms of how they can themselves better equip the system to sustain peace by addressing all stages of conflict. This is in their own words. In all dimensions, aiming to help prevent the outbreak, escalation, continuation, and recurrence of conflict. So much similar to what SPI is doing. In the context of that discussion, for example, the United Nations has recognized the intrinsic and inseparable relationship between sustaining peace and human rights. It has also acknowledged for the first time the destabilizing effect that military interventions have on ongoing crisis, even when these are carried out in the name of peace building and humanitarian purposes. More broadly, it has called for a stronger emphasis to be put on, including by making strong financial cases for prevention as opposed to response to conflict, and on strengthening partnerships for sustaining peace, including by investing in women and youth as peacemakers rather than victims. Now, to be clear, none of this is new in that is new per se. None of these elements are new. We've seen the United Nations discuss these before. What I think is new is the fact that for the first time, as far as I am aware, the UN is making a conscious effort to bring all these different bits and pieces of their own peace-building approach into one coherent vision, which is something similar to what SPI is trying to do here at HDS. Something else that I find interesting is that the United Nations is doing this at a time when there is enormous pushback from powerful member states on some of the very norms and notions that underpin this vision for sustainable peace, including the importance of protecting human rights and the prohibition and enforcing the prohibition against the use of military force in international relations. Some will say, of course, that thinking this, just launching a new agenda and thinking that this will imply real change, is not, that nothing will really happen until the UN gets serious about Security Council reform. And I agree with that. But I also agree with the fact that I also want to believe that this means something. And that is because I'm convinced that change does not happen in a vacuum. And so whether you're an activist, a peacemaker, an advocate, or a policymaker driven by a vision and ideal, I think you look for every opportunity to see and to do good. So against that background, and because I'm very aware that you're not here to hear from me, I'm going to ask you all, first our speakers, but then hopefully with the rest of the audience we'll have an engaged discussion on these issues. I want to ask you, do you think that we're facing a new process of norm formation with regards to the way we conceive a sustainable form of international peace and security? If so, what can we learn from our respective disciplines in the conceptualization of a new sustainable peace and security paradigm? What holistic approaches and cultures of peace do we need to pursue to materialize this vision? What are the challenges that we will be confronted with? What is the role that the civil society and religious communities can play in advancing this vision? And how and what can we teach in terms of leadership skills for the next generation of entrepreneurs to be well equipped? To guide us through this reflection, we're privileged to benefit of the presence of three of the most influential thinkers on these matters. Professor Gabriella Blum is the Rita E. Professor of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law at the Harvard Law School, specializing in international law, international negotiations, the law of armed conflict, and counterterrorism. She is the faculty director of the program on the international law of armed conflict and on the program on negotiation executive board. And she also served as a former senior legal advisor to the Israel Defense Forces and as a strategy advisor to the Israeli National Security Council. Professor Blum is the co-author of The Future of Violence, Robots, Germs, Hackers, and Drones, Confronting a New Age of Threats, written with Benjamin Watts, which received the Roy Palmer Civil Liberty Prizes. She also co-authored with Philip Heyman Laws, Outlaws, and Terrorists, which also received the Roy Palmer Civil Liberty Prize. She's also the author of Islands of Agreement, Managing Enduring Armed Rivalries, as well as of journal articles in the fields of public international law, international negotiations, and the law and morality of war. She's currently working on a book titled The Fog of Victory as a Carnegie Fellow. Professor Bryan Hehir is the Parker Gilbert Montgomery Professor of Practice of Religions and Public Life at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's also the Secretary for Social Services in the Archdiocese of Boston, specializing in ethics and foreign policy, religion and world politics, and Catholic social ethics. A member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the board of the Arms Controls Association, and the Global Development Committee, he was previously president and CEO of Catholic Charities USA, staff at the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops, and faculty at the Georgetown School of Foreign Service, the Kennedy Institute of Ethics, and the Harvard Divinity School. His publications include, among many others, The Moral Measurements of War, A Tradition of Continuity and Change, and The Moral Dimension in the Use of Force. Last but not least, our honoree for tonight, who is also a dear friend and a personal hero of mine, as well as the very personification of what I guess I'm referring to as a norm entrepreneur. Benjamin Ferencz, as we heard from Dean Hampton, is a Harvard alumni. He's an American lawyer. He's the last living prosecutor of the historic Nuremberg military tribunals. And after he became the chief prosecutor in the landmark Eisensgruppen trial that has been widely referred to as the biggest murder trial in history, he became the Director General of the Jewish Restitution Survivors Success Organization, as well as other charities, in his quest to provide victims of Nazi crimes of all backgrounds and faiths with compensation and restitution, something that hopefully we'll have an opportunity to discuss. But he wasn't done there. For the past 70 years, Ben has been recognized as one of the most indefatigable proponents of international justice as a means towards world peace. He has advocated his entire life for the establishment of a permanent international criminal tribunal that would have jurisdiction over the same crimes he tried in Nuremberg. And he also fought his whole life to make sure that wars of aggression stayed a criminal offense under international law. Both of these goals actually have come to fruition. In 1998, the world came together to sign the Statute of the Hague-based International Criminal Court, and just this past December in New York, the member states of that court came together to decide to activate the court's jurisdiction on the crime of aggression, which had been frozen under the statute for a series of political reasons, thus completing what many have called the legacy of Nuremberg. In his 99 years of age, Ben remains one of the most vocal champions of the rule of law, including accountability for the illegal use of military force. For his service to the cause of international peace, he has truly become a human rights icon. He's received the French Légion d'honneur, the Erasmus Prize from the Dutch government, the MC Basuni Justice Award, the Martin Luther King Jr. Nonviolent Peace Prize from Martin Luther King's family, and the one prize that I know is dearest to his heart, the Harvard Law School Medal of Freedom. The city of The Hague has named a footpath next to the Peace Palace, the Benjamin Ferencz Path, to honor him as one of the figureheads of international justice. And at the end of this month, they will also be inaugurating a bench that says, the features is slogan, law, not war. So we will begin today's discussion with a series of questions that I will ask him to give all of us an opportunity to get to know him a little better. And then after that, we will invite Professor Hehir first and then Professor Blum to come to the podium and give a few thoughts in response. And after that, we'll have a conversation with all of you. Now, without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Ben Ferencz to the floor.
I agree with everything that old man said. I'm glad to be here with some old friends, Father Hehir. You know, I get his blessing. I'm way ahead of the crowd. I could use it. Now you're going to ask me some questions?
Yes.
Well, go ahead. We were listening long enough to all that stuff. No?
All right, so Ben, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, your history, and your personal journey. Who is Ben Ferencz?
I don't know. I've never met the man. But to give you a quick rundown, I was born in a little village in Transylvania. Now, nobody ever knows where Transylvania is because it doesn't exist anymore. My sister was born in the same bed I was born, a year and a half before me. She was born in Hungary. I was born in the same bed. It was Romania. So what did I learn? I learned that it doesn't matter what the country is called. It's how they treat their people that counts. Well, both of them agreed that it was good to kill all the Jews, and it made life quite impossible for them. My parents fled to the United States, like many refugees today, with 2 infant children. No money, no skills, no job, no future, but it seemed better than what they had left behind, which was danger and poverty. My father became a janitor in Hell's Kitchen, and that's where I was raised my earliest years in New York. Well, so I have certain sympathies with the refugees of today, those who are going through the same type of beginnings. Now let me jump from there, since she's already told you I was a graduate of the Harvard Law School. So how did you get from there to there? Well, I got there somehow. And when I got there, the war broke out. Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor. Everybody I knew went down to enlist, including me. I chose the Air Force. I wanted to be a flyer because if you don't get wounded, you come down in parts, you go or you don't go. But my legs were too short to reach the pedals. They still are too short to reach the pedals. As a matter of fact, my pants keep getting longer as I get older. Well, I finally ended up as a private in the artillery, about which I knew nothing, and landed on the beaches of Normandy, where I had the unpleasant experience of seeing soldiers in American uniform floating face down in the water, the tanks stranded in the sand. I crossed the Rhine on a pontoon bridge, driving a Jeep, being fear of dumped in the water at any time, and participated in every major battle of the war, for which the Pentagon, when I finally got through, I think I spent more time fighting the US Army than the German Army, but nevertheless, they gave me 5 battle stars for not having been killed in any of the major battles of the war. And I thought that was a pretty good idea, not only giving it to those who got killed, but to those who managed not to get killed. But one of the interesting assignments, the most interesting assignment, I would say, during the war years, they discovered that because I had done the research for a Harvard professor who wrote a book on war crimes, Professor Sheldon Gluck, who was a criminal law expert at Harvard at that time, and the President of the United States had declared, together with the other heads of state, that the Germans would be held to account. And one day I was tapped on the shoulder of the 115th AAA Gun Battalion and said, you were to report to General Patton's headquarters, Judge Advocate Section. And I did, and I was told that they had been directed to set up a war crimes program and that my name had been forwarded from Washington. I assume it was via that Professor Gluck. The colonel who greeted me, his first question was, what's a war crime? They had no idea of war crimes as we know it today. War crimes meant absence without leave, conduct unbecoming a gentleman, desertion, things of that kind. I believe I was the first man in the United States Army in World War II to deal with war crimes. What did that consist of? It was 2 things. First, there were the Allied flyer cases. American and British planes would be flying over territory which was held by the Germans, either in France or in Germany. And they were shot down very often by our own anti-aircraft artillery. They failed to give us the right signal, identification, friend or foe, or they had been injured on a flight. When they landed on the ground, which was occupied by Germany, they were almost invariably beaten to death by the mob. People in the town would come out, beat them with their shoes, in specific cases, crack their head open with a crowbar. And my job was to get in there fast, find out what were the facts of the case, who were the perpetrators, where should they be apprehended, send out arrest orders to pick them up, and they would be put on trial before United States military commission trials, which existed and were set up in the Dachau concentration camp long before the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg was set up. And these cases are best forgotten, and probably forgotten deliberately. We would, let me say, with the Allied flyer cases, there are many interesting experiences. Time doesn't allow me to go into all of it, but these were normal people on the ground killing prisoners of war with a feeling of vengeance. I speak now of a specific case where there was a young woman whose 2 children had been killed in a bombing raid shortly before. And she joined in the beating the Allied flyers who had been shot down, 2 or 3 of them. And her mother said to me as a witness, I told my daughter, German girls shouldn't behave this way. And I felt rather sympathetic, I would say, to the motivation. And I placed her only under a house arrest. I didn't take her off and all. I said, you remain under house arrest, cannot leave without me. And I made my report. And she was eventually picked up and put on trial together with the fireman who had really used a crowbar and split the flyer's head open on the ground. I went to his house, of course, as well. He had fled somewhere. I asked his wife where he was. She said she didn't know. I said, you do his laundry? She said, yes, of course. I said, show me where. I took one of his shirts, which still had blood on it, as evidence, and used that as part of building up a case for trial. To jump a little bit ahead, to give you some feeling of what it's really like. I happened to be on my way home, I guess, and the war was almost over, and the trial of this girl was on. And there were several other war crime suspects as well. There was in benches like these, maybe 40 or 50 of them in a room. And when the time came for this girl to say something, she stood up and she fainted. And the doctor came there, and I asked him, how's she doing? He said, she's all right, but she's pregnant from an American soldier. Whether it was rape or whether it was consensual, I don't know. I mention it only to give you some feeling what happens in times of war. Here is a girl, a murderer, participating in a murder. She may have deliberately sought the child because the Germans believed if you were pregnant, you wouldn't be executed. And these were the Allied flyer cases. But that was nothing. Then began reports of coming to headquarters that people seemed to be streaming out of some kind of a work camp, and it looks like they're all starving. We did not know the name or the word concentration camp. It looked like a work camp. And they'd hand that to me. By that time, I was already the exalted rank of a corporal. And I would head out to the camp. Buchenwald was one of our earliest camps. In order for me to do my job, I couldn't do it as more the rank of a corporal, so I had arranged to have a pass signed for me by General Patton's command that everybody was to give me every possible assistance, and etc. And I was very seldom called upon to use that, but occasionally I was, and that pass, which I then had stamped secret, because I didn't want to have to show it too often, because it had been written by a drunken lieutenant at my request. I had dictated it, and I would head into the camp. Who's the commander here? I would say, I want 10 men immediately, close off the Schreibstube of the office. Nobody goes in or out without my permission. They would say, yes, sir. Snap to attention. I didn't wear any insignia, of course. And I would seize the records in the camp, which were very thorough. The Germans were very thorough. We would list how many people were killed, who was the commander in charge at the time. And with that evidence, I was able to put together very quickly a case. And the sentences were also very quick. They would call somebody there, Herr Schmidt, stand up. You're accused of being an accomplice to murder in the concentration camp, Buchenwald. They would say, so whatever. What do you have to say for yourself? not guilty, I was only obeying superior orders, I wasn't there, I was the cook, I was visiting my grandmother's funeral, all kinds of lies. Judges would hear it, very well, sit down. Next, they'd go through the whole room in maybe an hour, and then everybody would go out. The judges would say, we'll take time off now and render a sentence, come back 5 minutes later, all the defendants are found guilty and sentenced to death, and then they were taken to Landsberg prison and hanged or shot. We don't hear much about that. That was before the Nuremberg trials began. Now let's shift to what's the famous Nuremberg trial, the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. Justice Jackson, very distinguished judge from the United States, on leave from the Supreme Court, represented the United States very nobly. And the war was over. The other three nations, France, Britain, Soviet Union at the time, and China, were partners in the deal. We rounded up the most notorious named Nazis we could find and catch. Hermann Goering was one, Goebbels and others whose names have probably been forgotten by this audience. And we packed them in, 22 of them, into this main courtroom in Nuremberg. And the trials went on. Many of them were sentenced to death and executed. Then in addition to that, that's where I come in. The United States said, look, this is just a snapshot of German life. We want to get a more thorough picture. How is it possible that a civilized country like Germany could engage in all of the atrocities which I had described? And the atrocities that I had described were coming into these camps and seeing what was going on. Dead bodies lying all over the floor. Crematoria going, bodies stacked like cordwood in front of the crematoria waiting to be burned. People starving, every disease, groveling in the mounds of garbage for a morsel of something edible. The SS fleeing, running out, Americans chasing him, inmates catching some of the guards and beating them to death. Horror is the only word for it. And I gathered whatever evidence I could of the crimes. Didn't take long, usually. The Germans had good records. And I'd make my report. We'd send out arrest warrants for the commanding officers of these various camps. So we had this third layer, subsequent proceedings, as they were called. And I had gone home when the war was over. I had passed the bar exam. I'd finished my legal studies, and I hoped to get a job somewhere. I came back with about 10 million other soldiers. And one day I got a cable from the Pentagon, dear sir, you never called me sir in 3 years of military service. Will you please come to Washington? We'd like to talk to you. And I went to Washington, and there I was interviewed for a job. And the first man who interviewed me was a man by the name of then Colonel Mickey Marcus, who was a West Pointer, Jewish boy who had gone to West Point in order to get a free education. And he said, Ben, you have to go back. I said, me go back to Germany? You must be kidding. In order for me to go back to Germany, you have to declare war on Germany again and be losing. So he said, well, somebody else here wants to talk to you. And he referred me to a Colonel Telford Taylor. Telford Taylor later was promoted to general, and he was appointed to conduct 12 subsequent trials showing the other layer of German society, how the doctors who had performed medical experiments, the lawyers who had perverted the law, they made the film Judgment at Nuremberg based on that theme, the SS who carried out the executions, the diplomats who lied to the world, the industrialists who put up the money to build the concentration camps on the understanding that they would get unlimited supply of free labor. All of that was to be shown in the subsequent proceedings. And Telford Taylor interviewed me, and he said, I've checked your record, and I find that you're occasionally insubordinate. And I said, I'm sorry, sir, that's not correct. I am not occasionally insubordinate, I'm usually insubordinate. I don't obey any orders that I know are stupid or illegal. But I've been checking up on you. He was also a Harvard man. And I said, I don't think you'll give me that kind of order, and you can't find a better man. And he said, he smiled, he said, I'll take you, you go with me. We later became law partners in New York, and were very good friends. And he became a professor at Columbia University, then Cardozo Law School in New York, to which I've had the pleasure of naming some halls, some programs in his honor. Anyway, Telford Taylor said, look, you know all about the investigations of these trials, and we have to have the evidence. We have suspects, but we have no evidence. Unless we have the suspect and the evidence, you've got nothing. So you go and find the evidence. So I set up an office in Berlin, and the Army was in charge, the Pentagon in charge, and I had about 50 researchers going through all the German archives and bringing up whatever evidence looked like it was incriminating. And one of my researchers walked in one day and he said, look what I found. And he hands me a big folder, like a loose leaf folder, and it's Ereignismeldungen aus der UdSSR. I'm just showing off my German. It means events in the former Soviet Union. And these were daily reports of special squads called Einsatzgruppen. Nobody knew what it meant. Most people, including the dean of the Harvard Law School, could never pronounce it. They called it Einsatzgruppen or other. These were squads whose assignment was to follow behind the German lines and eliminate, kill, murder, exterminate. They never used such language. They said eliminate, you know. Every single Jewish man, woman, and child they could lay their hands on. And do the same for the gypsies or anybody else they thought might become a threat to Germany. And that's what they did. And then they made two big mistakes. One, they kept a record. Which unit had entered which town, how many people they had killed. Near Kiev, there was a ravine, got to be known as Babi Yar, 33,771 Jews, 29-30 September 1941. And I had a report, top secret, sent to Berlin, consolidated with the other reports, and issued in a distribution list of 99 people, and I had the list, who later said they didn't know anything about it. All of these reports going out daily from Berlin to all of these high-ranking Nazis, tabulating how many people were killed. I took a little adding machine, I added up when I got to 100, I said, that's enough. Excuse me. When I got to 1,000,000, I said, that's enough. I then took a sample, I flew from Berlin to Nuremberg, met General Taylor, said, General, we have to put on a new trial. He said, we can't. All the lawyers are assigned. Pentagon is not going to agree to any new budgetary increases. We just can't put on another trial now. I said, you cannot let these people go. I have in my hand mass murder on an unheard of scale, and I've got the proof right here in my hand. You just can't let them go. He said, well, can you do it in addition to your other obligation, which was the research on all this? And I said, of course. So he said, okay, you do it. And so it came to pass that I became the chief prosecutor in what was certainly the biggest murder trial in human history. I then made more human history. I rested the prosecution's case in 2 days. I think today's court, how long it takes before they get to trial. 2 days. They took them 5 months to come with their lies and alibis and so on. It took me a little while to repudiate all of them. They were all convicted, 22 defendants. Why only 22? We had 3,000 guys who every day were going out murdering people. They were all accomplices, every single one. Clear accomplices to mass murder. But we only had 22 seats. That was the trial against Goering and company. So for the ridiculous reason that we only had 22 seats, I had to pick 22 defendants. And how did I pick them? I picked them by their education and their rank. If they had a double doctorate, he's in the bag. Particularly, he was then probably at least a colonel. I picked SS generals. So everybody in that dock was a high-ranking, well-educated man. Doctor degrees, some with a double doctor degrees. Dr. Rasch, he did the Babi Yar job, these 33,771 Jews murdered in 2 days. put them on trial. They were all convicted. 13 of them were sentenced to death. Now there, as a sideline, it was expected that the prosecutor would ask for a death penalty in a case like that. I didn't. I didn't ask for any penalty other than what I'll tell you. Why didn't I ask for the death penalty? I said, how can you balance in the scales of justice 1 million people murdered, children by the thousands shot one shot at a time, you know, with these 22 guys? There is no way that I could find justice in this. So, but if I can get a rule of law which would protect everybody, because they were killed because they didn't share the race and the religion or the ideology of their executioners. And I thought that was a horrible thing. And if I could get the court, persuade the court, to lay down a rule of law that killing people for those reasons is a crime against humanity, punishable by whatever the court decides, I will have taken a step forward for the protection of everybody in the future, regardless of their race or creed. And that's what I was trying to do, very deliberately. The chief judge was Michael M. Westmano, a devout Catholic, who had been in the Navy during the war, and he had a naval uniform. He was a captain under his robes, and we got to be good friends after the trial. During the trial, we at long distance, he took a week off before the sentencing and went to a monastery, and he consulted with his priest, and then he came back, and then we began, you know, for the crimes of which you have been convicted, this tribunal sentences you to death by hanging. The courtroom door opens, a little lift goes down into the basement of a death cell, drops down, next one opens the door, takes off the earphones. For the crimes of which you've been convicted, this tribunal sentences you to death by hanging. Now put it on, boom, down into hell, 13 times in a row. Well, that was the end of the trial.
Ben,
And,
let me stop you there, because I think that you've already said so many things that are speak so much of the character of you as a man, but also of your values and of the type of challenges really that you are confronted with when you try to bring justice for these mass crimes. I want to begin by asking you, how did your work as an investigator and then a prosecutor shaped your vision later on? I think you touched on it, but maybe if you can expand on that in terms of what needed to be done for these crimes not to be perpetrated again in the future.
well, of course, the horrors that I personally witnessed are really incredible, just incredible. I've often asked myself, what drives me? I mean, I'm 99 years old now. What drives me? And surely there is a traumatic effect of what I have witnessed. It's really unimaginable that human beings could behave in such an inhumane way. And so I was trying. Then I said, we have to have a change in the way we approach other human beings, no matter what the crime is that we think they have committed. So I have been spending the rest of my life, I had to make a living for my kids too, but that's no way to make a living. But I spent most of my life trying to change the way people think about warmaking. It had been glorified for centuries as the way to power and freedom and victory and glory and all that. And in fact, it's what I saw. People being murdered, little children, one shot at a time, all the women being raped in the course of the war by the Russian soldiers in Berlin was classic. It was the reward for victory, so-called victory. And all of that has shaped my determination to do whatever I could to protect the future. I couldn't do anything for those who are already killed, the 6 million or 10 million. Nobody knows how many people get killed in war. I know that from my own observation. I was there when we shoveled them with plows, snow plows, into holes in the ground. And How many people die of heartache? How many people die of suffering and of sickness because of the war? Nobody knows the figures. But surely there must be some better way of organizing the relationship of one human being to another, which would prevent that from happening.
So I want to return to this question of how do we change the relationship. But before, I want to talk a little bit more about something else in your legacy that I don't think it's enough discussed, and it's a big part really of your legacy. After the trials, you worked to really provide compensation and restitution, so to as many victims as you could. And in your earlier remarks, you said, well, really, how do you balance the scale of justice? What is fair compensation and restitution? Can you walk us through some of the challenges you encountered?
I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's usually overlooked, and I usually overlook it as well. But there were two various phases in my life. One is the war itself, doing what I could, bring that to an end. The next thing was to take care of the victim. To first say, well, I think before we got to the victim, took care of the criminals, stopped the criminals, and used what you're sentencing, the power of the law, as a deterrent to any future actions along those lines. That was the goal. It was not vengeance on these handful of people. It was to create a legal deterrence for the future. But then, what about the victims? The victims, those that were still alive, the survivors, they had nothing except a tattoo on their arm. Their families had been killed, their property had been stolen, they'd been driven out of their country, they were sick. And so my first assignment then after that was under military government law, a requirement that those who had stolen property from the Jews or had been forced to transfer property under duress, they would have to return the property and get back what they had given. If there were no claims, it was heirless or unclaimed property, it would go to a successor organization, and that was me.
Well, not you in your pockets.
Well, I'll tell you, it was me. I was approached by a representative of the American Joint Distribution Committee, which is a well-known Jewish charity taking care of cases of this kind. They sent a representative from Paris to talk to me in Nüremberg at the time, and they said, look, we have this law that says that heirless and unclaimed property can be claimed by a successor charitable organization, and the proceeds used for the benefit of all the survivors. And we think that you should be the man for that job. You know your way around the Army. By that time, I had a simulated rank of a general in the Army. I'd gone from sergeant of infantry when the war was over to general a few months later. We think that you're the one. We don't, of course, we don't have any money to pay your salary except for the first 6 months. But we don't think much will come. We have an obligation to try. So I took them over that job. I was the first employee. So I immediately declared myself to be the Director General of the Jewish Restitution Successor Organization, which was the official title. And then I have to get money to run the show. So I went to see General Clay, who was in charge. And I said, look, I want to get this program going. He said, we had a 4-month filing deadline. I said, you've got to extend the deadline. He said, I can't. He said, well, I can't do it. I'm not going to extend it. And I don't know when the Russians are coming in here. And we want to get these DPs, displaced persons, out of here as soon as possible, and we want to get this program out of the way. I said, look, I can't get it out of the way without funds. I need staff to go into all the real estate registries, find out who had transferred property, set up a staff, hire lawyers all around to do all this work. I said, can you lend me the money from U.S. share of occupation funds? He said, the British will never agree. He said, the French will never agree. It's all quadripartite controlled. I said, but I'll borrow it. I'll repay it when the time comes, when I get it back. He said, can I do that legally? And I said, I have a memo in my pocket that says you can. He said, okay, go down and see Joe and tell him I said it's okay. So I went down to see Joe and I said, I just come from the general. We got to put out a snappy program here. I need 1 million marks right away. It's like walking in and saying, I need $10 million. And he didn't care, it wasn't his money. I got the money and boom, off I went. And setting up and filed 163,000 claims for property before the filing deadline. So anyway, this is a sideline to getting down to the more important things. And then in 1951, it was Chancellor Adenauer, a very decent Catholic chancellor, made a speech to the public, which he said, look, terrible crimes have been committed against the Jews in the name of Germany, and imposed upon us an obligation to make amends, try to make amends. And so the Jewish organizations, the same group that I had in the Jewish Restitution Organization, said, Ben, you know your way around. How about you undertaking that in addition, of course, to your other things? No additional pay, of course, but in addition to that. I said, okay, I'll do that too. And so I became the director of the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany. And that was a relatively small organization. The other one, claiming properties all around the world. I had to set up a legal aid society to help the people. I had staff 1,000 people for that. But the next phase of it was the negotiating a compensation agreement. Now there, an interesting point for you, if we have enough time for all these stories. I became a target of a terrorist group. Not only me, but the chairman of the Claims Conference, who was Malcolm Goldman, chairman of the World Jewish Congress, and a half dozen others who were working with me on trying to negotiate a treaty between West Germany and the Claims Conference and the State of Israel, which had given refuge to the victims as they came out. And there was a group in Israel who said, what? You're going to sit down with these people who murdered my parents and talk to them about money? Have you no shame? It's a disgrace. Jewish son or anybody would sit down with these Nazi bastards and talk money. And we'll kill you all, the Germans and you as well. And so there was a terrorist gang, and we were very closely guarded. All this information is not in public knowledge, maybe now in some of my recent writings, but at that time it was hush-hush. The guards, we had to be very careful. We were negotiating in The Hague, in a secret hideout in Castel-Udvacenar, near where the court is now. And what was most interesting was that one of the leaders of the terrorist gang, as we know them, was a gentleman by the name of Menachem Begin, who became the Prime Minister of Israel and also got the Nobel Peace Prize. So you'd be surprised who gets Nobel Prizes.
Well, but also, as you always say, be careful who you call a terrorist.
Be careful who you call a terrorist. Moral story, it's complicated. Anyway, so I'm trying now, the next phase is to prevent it from happening again,
right.
And that is the most important. I had 4 children born in Germany. People say, how'd you manage that? I said, the courts were offered a recess. But for the sake of the children and those yet to come, there are not too many young people here. I've been trying to build a future for them which would be safer than the past. And it's worse. It's very dangerous, as has been pointed out by the dean. And we live in, and Father Hehir as well, in his early writings about nuclear weapons. We live in a very, very dangerous world today. The nuclear weapons are already obsolete. We have cyberspace. And here too, I'll tell you something which I haven't written much about. About 10 years ago, I had a meeting in St. Petersburg, Russia. It was a conference of disarmament or something like that. And there was the only other American there was a general. And he was in civies, and I said, let's have breakfast together. I said, what are you up to? He said, I'm working on the cyberspace problem. I never heard of cyberspace. I said, well, what's that? He said, well, you know, now, when he looks around, we're in a dining hall. And he said, now, you know, we can now cut off the electrical grid on planet Earth from cyberspace. I thought, cut off the electrical grid. You mean all the lights go out, everything goes out? Yeah, he said, yeah. No water pumps work, the hospitals don't work, the red light, the radio doesn't work, nothing works. I said, then how long will it take for everybody to die? He said, well, I'm not familiar with any real studies that have been made on that subject yet, but it might depend upon the amount of water they had. If they had water, they probably could live for about a week. And I said, well, I haven't had any studies. I know that from my limited experience, if you hang a man by the neck in 8 to 10 minutes you can pronounce them dead. But cyberspace, well, it dawned upon me that the old notions of state sovereignty, you can do whatever you like within your borders, which was very good sense 200 years ago. Today it makes no sense at all. And with the cyber spread danger hanging over your heads, on which billions of dollars are being spent, which could have been used for sending for the kids, there are not too many here, for their education, for the old people, for the hospitalization, the hospital care, for the refugees, to provide proper housing for them, instead of pumping in billions of dollars to preserve our nuclear arsenal, because we don't know what to do with the waste, and to build cyberspace weapons which will kill everybody on this planet. We've got to wake up. And you may have seen that in that little flash there when I talked to the young people. Things have changed. Law is not static. Law changes. It must change to meet the needs of society. And now the needs of this society are to prevent any future war. And so I have been working on defining aggression. The American government has fought me tooth and nail, but not in an open way. They have said, not that we're against it. No. Aggression is a terrible crime. But how do you define it? For 70 years, I sat in the UN, and every meeting of the committee dealing with that, practically every committee, I heard the debates, hundreds of lawyers saying they can't define aggression. That, my friends, is a lot of baloney. They can define aggression. It has been defined. It was defined by Justice Jackson. He didn't put people on trial for crimes they didn't know were crimes. And we had an International Law Commission, and we had all kinds of other definitions. It's an excuse given to conceal the fact. And that's the hub of the problem which you all have, and I don't have it anymore, I'm 99 years old. But the hub of the problem is the United States and others are not prepared to allow any foreign court judge the legality of the use of force by the United States. And the Russians feel the same way. The Chinese have said, you do it first, and then we'll see. We'll do it the same. And so they pretend that it's because of the definition. Well, we have so many definitions. I wrote a 2-volume book on defining aggression, and I got some stuff here even with me on all that topic. That's a lot of malarkey. That's an excuse. Politically, they're not ready to accept it. Now, we have a great democracy. America is a great democracy. It's normal that there would be differences of opinion on important subjects. And I welcome that. And they should be respected. But it doesn't mean you have to be followed if you think it's wrong. And I think the current policy will lead to the death of your children and your grandchildren. There's no other choice. It's coming your way. And I see it coming. And I'm trying to warn you. And I want nothing for myself, nothing. I'm 99 years old, and that's you know, I've seen it. So you've got to be prepared to think differently about the whole method of how do you deal with differences, fundamental differences in values of different things. Most of the causes of war are done by religion in the first instance, nationalism in the second, and economic circumstances in the third. And the people who are willing to kill and die for those particular causes are the people who are the most dangerous. And how do you cope with that? You teach, as I'm sure that is being taught here in the Divinity School, tolerance, compassion, a willingness to compromise. It's no disgrace to be willing to compromise. It takes courage not to be discouraged. It takes courage to try to find the other fellow's point of view and find a way of peaceful settlement of disputes. And that's what I'm hoping to do. And I'm very grateful to the Harvard Divinity School. I hope the Harvard Law School would also be participant in this goal. They had some hesitations. Dean Monfamino was a dear friend also. And it's going to take a re-education of the way people think about when they use force.
Ben, let me ask you one last question, and then we can give the floor to Professor Hehir and Professor Blum, and then we can continue this discussion. from what you've told us so far, it's obvious to me, I think to everyone in the audience, that you face incredible odds and resistance in pushing for your ideals. And sometimes it's fair, I think, to say that some of your ideas at times have been belittled as the ideas of an idealist, as if that was a bad thing. When you first said we need a permanent international criminal court, you were told, well, that's not possible to do. And then you said, well, we need to criminalize aggression, and then you were told, that's not possible to do. And yet, here we are today, we have the court, we have jurisdiction on aggression. So my question to you is, how do you do it? How do you stay so faithful to your goals and visions, but also how do you stay so positive?
All right, fair question. I admit I'm an idealist. I don't think that's a dirty word. I believe it's possible to do the impossible. I can prove it to you, very simply. Look at our Constitution, the great American Constitution. Women had no right to vote. They couldn't own property. Tell it to the women in this room. Running for president, head of state, so on. What a change. There were a couple of boys on a bicycle. They said you put a wing on it and you pedal it, it's going to fly. And they said if God wanted men to fly, would have given them wings. There are 1,000 planes in the air at this moment, flying like birds, can't pass. Impossible. Sure, they told me it's impossible. Nations will never agree to a third-party settlement over when they use force. I know it's going to be difficult, but we are beginning it. We have national courts now dealing with these terrible crimes that are being committed all around the globe. The Security Council has betrayed their trust, and I use the word advisedly. They were assigned, quote, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. They have not. And they never did. They never had the courage to try to do it. So we have to make some changes there too. It can be done, and it will be done, and it must be done. That's what drives me. And I see it in my own life, my own capacity, a little guy from nowhere, you know? And I get all these distinguished people coming here and they're applauding me. It always amuses me. They named the street after me and hey, you didn't mention that.
Yes, I did.
And they now have a bench there and you can sit down and rest with the Benjamin Ferencz bench or whatever it is. I haven't seen it yet. I got to go for a ceremony. But what I'm saying is that if it makes good sense to you, as it must now, that law is certainly better than war, no matter what. Even if you get a bad decision, it's better than a war. So I've argued law, not war, because people like slogans, and it's an easy slogan. And then to add to it another slogan, how do you get there? I give them 3 pieces of advice. 1, never give up. 2, never give up. 3,
never give up.
That's it works. And so you get the point. And you'll be surprised how many young people are with me. And I look to the young people and to the women for taking the lead now on this. There's never been a war without rape. There never will be a war without rape. We want to stop rape, and I think we should try to stop rape. Try to stop war making at the same time. So the ball is now in your court. I can't go on, I don't know how much longer, but as long as I can, I'm going. I'm taking it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I am finished.
Professor Hehir, please, you have the floor.
Now, Father Hehir is an old friend, so I'm going to see what he's going to jeopardize our friendship here.
So you came to hear a panel, and I came to be on a panel. But what we just saw was a remarkable oral history, the kind of thing that just needs to be preserved. That was not a speech, that was a testimony. Testimony in the sense that the word is used in the scriptures, testimony in the sense of a life lived in the midst of complexity and danger, in the midst of the most awful human crime of the 20th century, and he comes out of it with that kind of humanity. That is an extraordinary accomplishment. It also makes any response rather intimidating. And the only key to turn to the topic I've been asked to speak on for 12 minutes maximum, the only thing that holds that together is that he can move from this powerful human experience and translate it into the need to shape things by law and policy and ethics, which is a much drier topic, a much more abstract topic. But once again, the wisdom of his life is he knows if we can't do that, then the potential is always open that someone else will have to do what he did. So that's my only defense, to turn to this question I've been asked to address about the state of our security system that we use globally. The issue is about peace and security, and those two words have a long history that takes us through not just nations and states, but empires, and the stuff of history which is a mix of tragedy and heroism, as you've heard about tonight. So what about this question of the state of our security system? Security systems have been part of world politics for centuries. We use the term in a technical sense today, but as you look back through the history of war and politics, security systems have always been built to try to make sure that the last war would be the last war. They look differently at different times. The Peace of Westphalia after the religious wars was a form of a security system. The 19th century balance of power was a form of a security system. The 20th century League of Nations was a security system. Woodrow Wilson, believing that the balance of power was what caused World War I, said, "What I seek to do is to move from a balance of power to a community of power." And what he meant by that was what came to be called collective security. Now, the problem that security systems must face is framed, I think, by three words: community, sovereignty, and anarchy. There is one human community of equal dignity in each person, multiple cultures, multiple countries, but there still is one human community. Sovereignty is the way the world is organized to govern human communities. So sovereignty has a much more restricted sense than community. It's always a community of a given body of people. But the problem is when you have a single human community governed by multiple sovereignties, then what the political scientists will tell you is that you live in a world of anarchy. Anarchy not meaning constant chaos, but anarchy meaning there's no center. There's no place where the law can be simply announced and enforced. No center of political authority that can make the law and guarantee its enforcement. That would be the hope of a man like Ben Ferencz, that we lived in a world where there was a center of authority that could announce a law and then make it be implemented in such a way that the chances of war at least would decline. What is the security system we have? In its broadest sense, our security system is the successor to the League of Nations. It is the UN Charter, fashioned in 1945, and the UN organization that lives and seeks to implement that. This idea of collective security is embodied in the UN Charter, even as it was in the League of Nations. In a sense, the UN Charter resurrected the idea and then modified it. And in modifying it, it bowed to sovereignty. The UN was the creation of sovereign states. And so it bowed to sovereignty by saying the great powers have to be acknowledged because they weren't and the League failed. So we have the Security Council with the veto, a bow in the direction of sovereignty. And to some degree, the Charter also brings with it the legacy of Westphalia. Sovereign states who believe they have the right to use force under certain circumstances. So what we end up with in the security system of the Charter, as I read it, regarding the use of force, is a mixed system, the legacy of two paths. Article 2.4 is the one that Ben would hang his hat on. Force should not be used in the relationship of states, countries, and peoples. That's the bow to peace. Article 51 says sovereign states have the right to use force if they're attacked. They don't have an absolute right, they have a limited right, but it's a real right. Article 2.7 says that the United Nations does not have the right to interfere in the domestic jurisdiction of sovereign states. Sovereignty surfaces again. But Chapter 7 of the Charter says, under collective security, if states are creating great crimes, even domestic jurisdiction can be voided. And we not only can use force to stop aggression, we can use force to stop human rights within states. Within that framework, then the Charter and our security system has developed ideas that weren't in the words of the Charter. So peacekeeping today is one of the ways we try to hold the security system together. Peacekeeping, Chapter 6 of the Charter, says essentially when you've had a conflict and there is at least a narrow strip of peace to be kept, then the UN can authorize forces to go in to keep the peace if the state grants consent, a bow to sovereignty. Going beyond Chapter 6, Chapter 7 says that peacemaking, the enforcement of peace where there is no peace, is once again possibly to be authorized by the Security Council, so the UN becomes an authorizing agent to use force to prevent aggression. And most recently, peace building at the UN has now taken on life. Peace building is not about primarily the use of force. It's about how you act inside countries and across countries to prevent violence. It is meant to try to limit the use of force within violence. And it is meant to rebuild countries, nations, and places after war has occurred. My only point about this is these three steps are innovations within the context of the Charter. Our security system is basically, I think, a mix of the UN, the League before it, Westphalia before that. It is a mixed system. It still needs to evolve. The challenge of our own time is that there's not one kind of war, there's three kinds of war. Most of us grew up in the Cold War, where war meant the war between two empires armed with nuclear weapons. The world we live in today produces three kinds of war. Interstate war, like World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. Secondly, internal conflict, which raises the question of humanitarian intervention. So that raises the question of can you modify peacekeeping and peace enforcement in a third step, and that's called the responsibility to protect, which violates sovereignty, another adaptation. So you have interstate war, secondly, internal war and intervention, and then transnational war and terror. So now it is no longer just states, it's non-state actors that can act like states. So how to judge our security system today? Is it a failure because there are so many conflicts? I would argue that is not the case. Is it enough? I would argue it is not the case. But the road ahead is to build step by step, piece by piece, to move from Article 2.4 to responsibility to protect, to move from Chapter 7 to peacebuilding. It's a multiple set of tasks, some of which have been creatively designed and some yet to be designed. But the powerful testimony we've heard tonight keeps us at work, because what Ben Ferencz lived through, we would hope the world would never live through again.
I'm very lucky that Professor Hehir had the duty to follow Mr. Ferencz's act. Though it wasn't sheer luck, I can admit, that was at work. It's a tremendous honor to be in this event with you, Mr. Ferencz, and with you, Professor Hehir. Professor Hehir, you made the first transition maybe from the sublime to the mundane, and I, as an international lawyer, is going to bring us to the pedestrian, so I apologize for that. Let me start with an uneasy, maybe politically incorrect truth to say in this room. Force is sometimes necessary. And in fact, the reason Mr. Ferencz was able to prosecute in Nuremberg is because the Allies fought and won a brutal war. The ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, did not prevent the genocide in Srebrenica and did not stop the ethnic cleansing of Kosovo. And the ICTR in Rwanda was established after 800,000 to 1 million people were murdered with machetes over 100 days. That's about 7.5 people per minute, if you do the math. So war or force is sometimes necessary. And in fact, law and institutions cannot exist without a relatively secure and stable arena. The question is it used too often? Is it used only in the right place, under the right circumstances? Can we reduce the number of instances in which it is either necessary or appropriate or justified? And here, I would say to Mr. Ferencz, I am not sure that the definition of the crime of aggression is so straightforward, partly because of Professor Hehir's allusion to, for instance, humanitarian interventions or the responsibility to protect. So let me start with piling on and telling you everything that's wrong with the international system, and sort of take the responsibility of the international lawyers who designed the system and who have not been able, whether it's their sole fault or not is a different question. So, as Professor Hehir told us, we live in still a Westphalian system of interstate world. My students often think, it's always been this case. In fact, the nation state is a kind of recent phenomenon, if you think about it, the arch of history. 400 years, roughly. But this is what we now have. We live in an interstate world, and Federica alluded to the UN. People from the UN will often tell you we are a members organization. Often when the UN is blamed for lots of things, they'll tell you, oh, we're not a thing, we're an amalgamation of things, which is called the states. If you have a complaint, go deal with them. And that system is still very much grounded in this idea of sovereignty. Sovereignty, as much as we talk about turning it into a responsibility, is mostly a shield. It is still mostly a shield. It is a shield from intervention. It is a shield from responsibility or from the good intentions, even, of others. So when a state fails to deliver on its own responsibility, either to its own citizens or to others, international law actually does not give us good tools on how to deal with it, other than through the goodwill of its leaders in any particular time. Sovereignty also means what we call in international law voluntarism. Countries pick and choose their obligations. By and large, this is still the case. There are very few rules that apply to everyone, regardless of whether they chose it or not. And in fact, most of international law, if you looked at it from sort of the Martian's perspective, is mostly about rights. It's the rights of states to defend themselves, the rights of states to be independent from external intervention, the rights of states to govern their territory. There are very few obligations, and even fewer obligations towards other states. Maybe more so towards a state's own individuals today, but very few towards other states. We don't have a language of, or a very developed language of, a duty of care, of concern, of redistribution, of assistance. We have rights. So we talk about the right to engage in targeted killings. We don't have a corollary obligation to also build a hospital or a school in the places that we target. And rights are both a limiting concept, but also an inviting concept. If I go to war and I justify it by the fact that I'm going to do good, I'm going to help people's rights, I'm going to protect them, I'm going to deliver democracy and the rule of law and gender equality, I have another, at least rhetorical, a weapon in my toolkit that I can use. Clean water is part of the Sustaining Peace Initiative. And as I read it, I thought, wow, isn't it the case that people should have access to clean water regardless of whether it leads to conflict or not? And it's interesting to hook that onto the Sustaining Peace agenda, because of course that's the big agenda. We worry about peace and security. We can't really talk, we don't have the right language to talk about just caring that people will have access to water, regardless of whether or not that's going to lead to an armed conflict later on. And the law here has been a complete stagnation of the law. And especially the law that we call the jus ad bellum, the things that Mr. Ferencz is most concerned about, the issue of aggression, of when is it okay to use force in the first place. And it's quite remarkable given what has happened to the other branch of, if you want just war theory, the jus in bello. So today we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of provisions regulating how we fight. We've made war incredibly a legalized regime where there are rules governing the conduct of hostilities, the treatment of victims, what constitutes a war crime, etc. And yet the rules on aggression, if you want, on when is it allowed to use force, are summed up in 3 single provisions of the UN Charter. They can't possibly answer all the questions. They don't. And we have not come to terms, we haven't found the political ability to clarify those, to expound on them, to really come to terms with what it would mean and what it would look like to have a more elaborate legal codex. That law, for instance, says nothing about non-international armed conflicts. It does not, in fact, regulate civil wars. None of it does. Okay. Compounding all of that is the complete malfunction of the institutions that were supposed to guide us through this exercise, expound on the laws, adjudicate those questions. And the UN system failure is not just a UN system failure. It's not just that the Security Council doesn't work. It's much worse than that. It is in place and it doesn't work. And the existence of the organization creates a path dependency that makes change that much more complicated, because it not only provides for what is, it also talks about how, or suggests how one might go about changing it. And the moment it's there and not functioning, it's much worse in some sense than not having it in the first place, or starting out from scratch, just imagining what a system should look like, what functioning institutions should look like, and try to come up with those. So the big concerns of our times are all those non-traditional international armed conflicts, the non-international, the internationalized, and all those are compounded by what Ben alluded to as the proliferation of technology. The cyber element is interesting not only because it allows states an enormous amount of power to shut down the electrical grid, it allows individuals the power to do that. And some of the stuff that I talk about in my book with Ben Wittes is exactly the rise of these technologies, whether it's robotic platforms, bioengineering, cyber, that devolve power and, if you want, democratize power and allow individuals and small groups to be threatening from anywhere around the globe. And the combinations of the rise of individuals, better or worse functioning states, technology, and lack of institutions is what makes the current system so complicated, so difficult, and so kind of demanding of response. So I think some of the things we need to strive for is to think about requiring those who do go to war a much better and clear articulation of why they're doing it, what are the goals they're trying to achieve, and what are the costs they think they're going to incur or impose on others. We don't even have that system. Under existing international law, states are supposed to tell the Security Council to report that they used force. In just war theory, you were supposed to give reasons. You were supposed to declare and explain why you're going to war. We don't explain anymore. We have one statement or one line. We don't specify what the goals are. We don't specify what we're seeking to achieve, at what cost we think we can do that, or whether all other alternatives, in fact, have been exhausted. So, force is sometimes necessary. I think it is sometimes justified. I also think no one gets to live with zero risk. We as individuals do not live with zero risk. We go about our lives always exposed to some risk. No state has the right in the present world to demand to live with zero risk. We are members of an international community. We enjoy the benefits of being in a network system. We have to shoulder some of the costs of that. And I think to be more generous, more caring, more thoughtful of how we go about our business. Thank you.
Professor Blum and Hehir, maybe if I could invite you to take a seat here with us, we can have an opportunity. We'll give Ben an opportunity to respond to both of you because I know he's been asking me, he wants to say something. And then after that, hopefully we can engage with the rest of the audience in this discussion. I'll keep my comments for later, but Ben, do you want to say something?
First, my response or comment, observation, I would say, is a better word, to Father Hehir's comments. He's given you a complete, accurate, clear presentation of the evolution of international law for the control of the conduct of independent states, and comes to the conclusion that, well, the world the way we have it now, and the only best way to get out of it is to pay more attention to humanitarian intervention to correct the injustices as we find them. It's very appealing, and it's inadequate in my judgment, and I'll tell you why. First, we call it R2P now, responsibility to protect. We used to call it humanitarian intervention. Humanitarian intervention got into disrepute because it was often used as the excuse to impose our will on another country which we didn't like the competition from, and we went in and wrecked it or whatever we did. And that's still the case. What is missing in that system, whether it's we call it R2P or humanitarian intervention, is a third party, an independent party, to determine when it's really humanitarian intervention, which is worthwhile, or it's subterfuge humanitarian intervention for the benefit of the intervenor. For that, you need not the parties themselves to decide, because they are both biased. And we don't have that. And what you said is very important. What we lack completely is enforcement. As long as we cannot enforce the law is meaningless. And I'm very much aware of that. And I've written 2 volumes also on enforcing international law. I summarize it in the words, so you don't have to buy the book. Everything on my website is free. No enforcement. What do you expect? So we have not yet begun to work on a system of effective enforcement, which of course would require independent judgment, not of the participants in any particular dispute. And we haven't done that because we haven't suffered enough yet. We haven't gotten the lessons we should have learned in every war that we've had. And there hasn't been enough awareness among the young people. Now, my answer to how do you get out of that hole, we have to emphasize more I wrote a little book called Planethood, and the theme of that book is we are all inhabitants of one small planet, and we must share the resources on that planet in such a way that everybody on that planet can live in peace and human dignity. That's the goal, planetary thinking, instead of what I call now obsolete. The state system, the state sovereignty is obsolete. It doesn't work in so many places that we have to rethink the order in which the members of this planet have to live if they're going to survive. So it requires new thinking for new directions, and the fundamentals have to be, and that's why I come to the divinity school, to teach them we have to have a change of heart and mind. Until you change the heart, you will not change the mind. And the heart must say that we are all human beings, and we're entitled to a minimum standard of human decency. If you see somebody who's starving, don't ask him why he's starving, give him some food, whatever the reasons may be. But until you've changed the heart, you cannot change the mind. Until you've changed the mind, you cannot change the politicians and those who bear the power. And these are the diplomats and the politicians. If the people will speak up as they did in Vietnam, on the Vietnam War, hell no, we won't go. And they march on Washington. I don't want them throwing rocks, and I don't want to throw them guns either. I'm for a pacific, a non-violent approach to all these problems, as was Martin Luther King and as was Gandhi and others. I follow in their footsteps. That's what we need, the change of heart and mind and a determination to let it be known to those in political power that we don't accept that anymore. And we're going to protest against it by whatever peaceful means is possible. And the education begins on the religious level, because that's the most powerful educational tool we've got. So I'm glad to see you here. I'm glad to see him here. I'm glad to be here. I take it from there. It's a long way to go. So all your points were well taken. They were correct, accurate, good description. But you didn't come up with a solution. Now mine may not be any better than no solution.
I won't be able to live as long as you, so I haven't got as much time as you've had to think about
this. I take it from a legal point and a moral point of view. It's legally and moral obligation to give up the use of force as we go forward. It is no longer a suitable tool because it's too dangerous.
Professor Blum, something you said really resonated with me. That is that, of course, sometimes force is going to be necessary. And what we really need to get better at is articulating better rationales for the reasons why we're sending our soldiers to war. And also making really clear what the cost is for using force, not just in terms of strategic objectives of any given conflict, but also in terms of what happens if you do use force when it isn't strictly necessary. So my question to you is, how can we do that better, and why are we failing to do that?
So I think in some ways the difficult conversation is, what do you change first, the norms or the institutions, and can you have one without the other when you talk about change? I hear Ben's words, we need to stop war entirely, and they're wonderful, and how can one argue with it? But I also think that in today's world, we're not there.
No, we're not there.
And, okay, and so I think the two realizations are that war or force is sometimes necessary, and yet it's obvious that it's being used too much. And we can talk about what we do, but there are other actors in the world.
Of course.
And then you ask me, well, how do we get to change our policies? And I think that has to do, so Ben alluded to the Vietnam protests. And of course, that is effective when you have a draft. If we're talking about the present American wars, the problem is that the system of war today doesn't rely, at least the wars that we engage in, do not rely on a special taxation or a special draft. And unless you know somebody serving in the military, your closest to the war is not that close. Now, how many people here visited Iraq or Afghanistan? How many do know personally somebody who served in the armed forces or is still serving in the armed forces? We've become more remote from the war, which is sort of an instrument of policymaking. In that sense, it is the return of the Kellogg-Briand idea, and it is very different from the wars that Ben witnessed or participated in. Again, this is a very one particular type of war. It is irrelevant to many others that go on in the world, and you can't generalize or extrapolate from that. But you asked me specifically about here and now, how do we get people interested? Well, part of it is a problem even in Congress. You see debates about the authority to use military force, the AUMF. People talk about extending it, not extending it. There's the sort of technical justification. Then you say, what is it that you hope to achieve? And what is it that you hope to achieve? And there is a complete inability to articulate anything other than, oh, we'll get the terrorists, or we'll make it more safe. At the other end, you see sort of, in both Afghanistan and Iraq, a kind of a whole menu of how is it that we're going to get safer. We're going to get safer by introducing rule of law and democracy and human rights and schools for girls and agricultural production and child literacy. And all those things, if we can get them in Iraq and Afghanistan, will make us safer. And that was the real security belief. So now go back to the charter. The charter tells you you're allowed to use force in self-defense. It actually doesn't say a lot about how much self-defense, what goals are permissible, at what cost. And that conversation never really involved or happened directly with the American people in the way that forced that kind of public participation and monitoring of what it was that was being sought or pursued in those places. But again, that is a very particular context, and we can't extrapolate from that to the problems of a lot of other wars that are happening.
No, but I think your answer is actually excellent, and it leads me very well in the question that I wanted to ask Father Hehir. Actually, this question is built on something that both of you have touched upon in your remarks. You talked about changing the really conceptions and the language of international law so that we start talking more about duties as opposed to rights. And Professor Hehir said in his remarks that ideally the future of the international security system is so that we move from prohibition against interference into domestic affairs to some form of RPP type of paradigm, or from peacekeeping as enforced by the Nation Security Council to peace building. And so in the context of tonight's conversation, and also to relate it to the purpose really that the Sustaining Peace Initiative here has at the Divinity School, what is the role And again, part of the answer was addressed by Professor Blum. But what is the role that the civil society, but especially religious communities, can play?
The role, can you say that again? What is
The move to
essentially
community.
Yeah. Well, I used three terms. Community can be understood as a moral term. It even can be understood as a theological term. Sovereignty is a legal term. Anarchy is a political term. The kind of topic we're talking about tonight cuts across these multiple disciplines, if you will. The idea of a community is only if you recognize certain philosophical ideas. We're not a world community as a structured entity. What counts as a community inside a nation doesn't apply to the world. If you believe philosophically that we are a shared humanity in which each person is embodied with equal dignity, that's one way to start looking at the world. In my view, it's the way you start to look at ethics and the world. But then you need to move to a different level because we're not organized as a community. We are organized as sovereign states. And so now you're in a different mode of discourse. You're talking about law and politics. You still don't want to lose the moral vision that you're trying to develop a world of law and politics that will work for the benefit of the whole community and not just some. But when you do it in terms of organized sovereign states, then you begin to ask the question how to organize sovereign states pursue not only their own interest, but what I would call a global interest. And it's a double, you have to work at two levels. You also have to deal with, I think, what Professor Blum is talking about, and that is to say that, you know, one of the great theologians that gets talked about in this room, I suspect still to this day, is Karl Barth, great Protestant theologian. Barth said of war that war was a Grenzmoral. War was a moral limit case. That is to say, war can be morally necessary and justified, but it ought to be the last resort. It ought to be limited in its conduct and in its motivation. And therefore, when you're trying to deal with the welfare of the global community that is mediated through sovereign states, each state with the capacity to make war, then you have to ask the question, how do you build a system of law, politics, and ethics that set limits on what states can legitimately do and may necessarily do? Final point, none of these terms are clean. So to go to Ben's point, you're absolutely right. Intervention has a bad history. So I always distinguish between what I call great power intervention. Great power intervention is 19th century great power politics. It's 18th century cabinet politics. Intervention by itself ought to be presumptively wrong. That's where sovereignty is helpful. Sovereignty gives you an in principle protection against intervention. The question is whether intervention should be absolutely wrong in all circumstances. And that's what Rwanda tells you. If you do that, you're going to regret it. So intervention has a bad history. Humanitarian intervention, I think, is a necessity in a world of sovereign states governing a global community when states can do harm not only by going outside their boundaries, but can do great harm inside, and that's the purpose of RTP, is to say when that kind of evil happens, you need to presumptively honor sovereignty, but you need to override it in certain circumstances. That's the idea of a Grenzmoral. You're at the very edge of the moral universe, but you're still inside it.
Okay, I was going to agree with Father Hehir, that we now have to restructure our thinking about these fundamental things, as sovereignty. Sovereignty is obsolete in today's world. And humanitarian intervention is, of course, essential, but it's got to be controlled by people who are not the parties, who seek gains for themselves. So that's what we used to call law.
I always say,
doesn't allow for it.
I always say when you try and think about world politics, you need to think about the ethics of character, the ethics of choice, and the ethics
That's the
of
reason
community.
we end up in the divinity school. These are ethical,
and the
religious
ethic
problems.
of character is about mind and heart. But remember your good friend Martin Luther King. When King was demonstrating and when King was leading a crisis of conscience in the country, people said to him, you've got to change their minds and hearts.
That's right.
But what King said was, I may not be able to get everybody to love me, but if I change the law, I can make them respect me. And that is the first step before you get to total conversion.
Yes, I think that there's a few questions from the audience. 1, 2, and third hands I saw go up, and then 4. Please introduce yourself very briefly.
Oh, okay. My name is Cindy Singer. I'm a local lawyer. When you said that when Ben said that you prosecuted the top 22 people, I was always under the impression that the message from the Nuremberg trials was not about the top people, but that the bottom people could not obey the top people. They had a moral and a legal duty not to obey when it was wrong. And I'm wondering if that's incorrect. And also I'm wondering what happened to the other 3,000 people? Were they allowed to get away scot-free?
I'll answer the second one first because it's a clear fact. They were never tried. And then your first one, it's a phony argument, superior orders. Every German soldier was required to carry with him a little they called his old book. It looked a little bit like my passport, which I have here in my pocket. And in there it says that he has to obey all legal orders. He doesn't have to obey orders that are not legal. And killing little children, one shot at a time, is not legal, and everybody knew it. So that is no excuse. They got away because we couldn't stay in Germany forever having war crimes tried.
I thought they didn't get away, so they can be prosecuted if they obey an order that's not legal.
That's correct. It's not, that's a crime. But can't try everybody.
Yes, sir. You were at Nuremberg and you stared Nazis in the face and you looked them dead in the eye. What did you see? Did you see evil? Is it something that you could distinguish from any other conflict?
That's a very good question because it's very often misunderstood. They asked me that on 60 Minutes. How could I meet with these monsters? You know, it killed thousands of children. And I said they were not monsters. I said, how can you say they're not monsters? I knew the people. The man I was talking about was a Major General of the SS, Dr. Otto Ollendorf, father of 5 children. He was not a monster. He was a patriotic German, doing what he thought was in the interest of his country, because he was told by the head of state that the Russians planned to attack, and he therefore thought it was lawful for him to intervene first in order to prevent that attack. It's a type of argument you still hear from the Pentagon today, preemptive self-defense. The judge, Michael Musmano, said that is not common sense, it's wrong in law and it's wrong in logic, and it sentenced Ollendorf to hang. Now, I didn't attend the hanging. I was invited to go. I didn't want to go. I got some films of it. But the people who were the top people were the same as top people in the United States and other countries. They think they're serving their country by dropping the atomic bomb on Japan, killed thousands of children. Were they monsters? The question I put to 60 Minutes, she never answered. They're not monsters. Our system is such that you get desperate at the end, you don't know how to change it. We don't have the institutions available to provide humanitarian assistance in a fair tribunal, which the state is willing to accept. And so we have to recognize that the world is changing. It's changing very dramatically, particularly now with the cyberspace threat. And it's all the more important to recognize that every human being is entitled to be treated as a human being, regardless including when it's a criminal. We outlaw torture, which used to be every palace, every prince had a torture chamber. In Europe, deal with the torture. The Vatican had a special list of special tortures, which were very good. But the things have changed, and we've got to recognize that and begin to build the changes that we need. And it begins with the heart and mind. That's the foundation stone. Once you have enough people who recognize that they need a change, we'll find a way of doing it.
Yes, I think Dean Hampton wants to ask a question right away. Yes, please.
So this is a little bit of a follow-on from that around cyberspace, and maybe mostly directed at Gabriella. So there's an article in today's New York Times, which you may have seen, from Christopher Kirchhoff, who has a Harvard connection. And the title of it is Silicon Valley Must Go to War. And the argument of it is really that he's arguing that the big tech companies in California, instead of remaining morally neutral in this whole arena, ought to be building closer bridges with the Pentagon to make smarter cyberspace war tools and mechanisms. And the implicit argument of it is that it's better that the United States does this because it's a democratic society, and if there's going to be the smartest kind of international force, that it should be US-led. The problem with the article a little bit, I think, though I'd love to hear your views on this, is that there's no real clear delineation of the ethics of this. It seems almost like a Manhattan Project argument 70 years later, that if someone's going to have these kind of weapons and technologies, better us and better using the commercial sector and all of that. So my question to you really is, should the big tech companies out west keep their distance from the Pentagon and the military establishment, or should they be cooperating with them in order to produce more advanced technologies around the use of force because it's us having them?
It's tough. So one of the most hotly debated topic now in sort of my crowd is the what's called the killer robot campaign, and whether to try and prevent or lead a call where the leading governments would just decide, come together, and just like they banned other types of weapons, although very few types of weapons, there'll be a decision to ban autonomous weapon systems or artificial intelligence, AI-based systems, where humans are taken out of the loop increasingly. And autonomy is not a one or zero, it's a spectrum, but essentially the big question is who should make the ultimate decision to kill, whether it has to be a human or could it be a robot or a machine. And I took the article refers to the Pentagon Project Maven that is looking increasingly at the reliance on AI platforms in the Pentagon and development of technology. And at least a central argument in the article wasn't even normative, it was just descriptive. That part of what makes this so challenging is that it's exactly not the Manhattan Project. And it's exactly different from nuclear weapons in the sense that nuclear weapons can still be monopolized, in the sense that it takes a very particular access to the materials, to the knowledge, to the infrastructure. It's a very, very big deal to make a nuclear bomb. And so, fortunately, it's still the case, and we can limit the number of actors with access to it. The Silicon Valley problem and our problem is that everybody has access to AI. Bloomberg, website, travel agencies, everything you do online today, financial services, All the tech companies, almost every single website you're using is now AI empowered, and increasingly so. And the problem for Silicon Valley is that there is no dividing line between the AI that they develop for commercial, either benign or even benevolent purposes, and the same AI technology that can be applied for military purposes. And that brings you into a whole set of ethical questions about what does it mean to have a war when you have no skin in the game? That you have machines fighting other machines. You're protecting American lives. You also make it cheaper, easier to go to war. There are lots. Can you program these machines in a way that would follow the ethics and rules of warfare? How well can they do it? Even if they could, is it moral not to risk yourselves and kill other people? So there's a whole host of these questions, and I think the point is whether you want the US to lead this or not. By the way, the United States has been a persistently reluctant to negotiate the rules over anything that the cyber world invites, whether it's a sort of cyber convention or what the rules are. There's a belief that if we move first and we set the rules, others would follow. May or may not be correct. But I think that's a whole separate discussion that is fascinating, partly because it shows you how difficult it's going to be to maintain any monopoly over the use of force and over these kind of destructive weapons in the years to come.
Thank you very much for that. Mr. Ferencz, I can't express my feelings as to how happy I am to be here listening to you. I watched the 60 Minutes last year when you were interviewed. My question is, I'm just a member of the public. Regarding aggression, I'm not really sure why it's so difficult to basically know what it is. It's a little bit like pornography. You can't really describe it, but you know what it is when you see it. So all these lawyers and academics sitting around trying to define what aggression is, I think there's a bit of an issue there from a public's point of view. But the question I have for you is, it seems like the Germans were fighting two wars. One was at the front, against the British and the rest. But they were also fighting within. They were fighting their own people, and the Jews were their own people. So when you were at the Nuremberg trials and you were looking at these people, and some of them, they look like they're waiting for a bus. They're just sitting there, waiting for the verdict. What is it that you learned that you can share with us about the human psyche when it comes to aggression?
Good evening. My name is Anne Pratt. I'm a Harvard Fellow working on a new global paradigm of leadership based on the lessons of Nelson Mandela. And the question I have, which actually draws on points made from each of our wonderful panelists. Professor Bloomberg, you made the point that at times war is necessary. In the case of South Africa, Mandela himself said there was a certain point when war became necessary in the liberation struggle. Ben, you made the point about it needs a combination of heart and mind, and Mandela, by his own admission, went through his own personal transformation in jail, where he enabled his heart to rule his mind rather than the other way around. His mind to rule his heart and his anger, and it was that personal transformation that enabled him to transition from being a freedom fighter to a president. And the point made by Professor Hehir about community, having grown up in a very strong culture of Ubuntu, which is a very strong sense of an integration of humanity and building a South African society for a greater life for all. My question to all three of you is, where is the role of leadership in all of this, and how do we kind of weave these different themes together in understanding what it takes of a leader of an organization, whatever that organization is in conflict, to transition out of conflict into peaceful reconciliation?
Let's take one question at a time. Take the first one. What did I learn about the hearts and minds of people who can be mass murderers? I learned that people can be mass murderers. All people. If you just whip them up enough and tell them, that something they value more than life itself is being threatened, such as their religion, such as their nationalism, their flag, or their economic circumstance. If they believe those values are being threatened, they'll kill you or die trying, whether we're any country, all the same. The second question is what?
Traits of leadership.
Yeah, so what is it, essentially in short, what is the role of leadership in all this, in transforming from violence to peace?
Leadership is, by definition, a leader. I think you're asking that there should be good leaders and bad leaders. Hitler was also a leader. He was a leader who believed that one of the things should be done if you could kill all the Jews. I took a dim view of that, but that was more personal than otherwise. And leadership plays a very important role, but the most important role is not the leader, it's the people who follow. Use your common sense, use your brain. Don't just follow blindly because the leader tells you you've got to do it. Ask yourself why. Who's going to have to pay the price? What is the price? Is it worth paying? And if you don't think it's the right thing to do, don't do it. Tell the leader, you go, not me.
Professor Blum here, do you have any maybe final thoughts to wrap up the conversation today?
No, I think this has been complicated enough.
Yeah. It's been complicated enough. Then on that note, I will spare you my own comments and I'll bring the floor back to Dean Hampton. Thank you, please, to all the panelists, of course, the three panelists tonight.
So this will be very brief because I know we all want to go to the reception. I'd just like to present Ben with some just very small gifts from the Divinity School.
Oh, just what I always needed.
Just to make your trip back to Florida more difficult. But there's a wonderful little...
Oh, look at this.
Yeah.
Oh, look at that. It's going to say something nice on there. Hey, look at it. If I don't break it before I get it home. Okay.
So it just says, religions and the practice of peace, Harvard Divinity School.
Friends for Sustainable Peace, Gratitude, Ben Ferencz. Oh, that's very
2018.
Nice. Thank you very much. I promise to have peace 2018. All right, let's put it back in here.
So I'd just like to say in conclusion, I think Bryan Hehir really put it very well at the start of his talk, that I think what we listened to tonight was a remarkable oral history of a remarkable person that was also a word of testimony to us and a little bit of baton passing to us, that these are concerns that we need to be deeply invested in. So thank you for that. And thank you to our other two panelists who had the tough job of not being able to deliver an oral history in quite the same way, but with a real sense of the complexity of the issues facing us and how they're changing pretty quickly in front of us. So these are something that we, in a place like Harvard, use all the kind of tools, disciplines, approaches that we can muster to think well about these problems, which are big and difficult to get our minds around. So finally then, please do come to our reception. Please do look at the books that are out there from Ben Ferencz. We look forward to seeing you again in the fall when we'll have our fifth colloquium series in the RPP. If you have any suggestions on things or people or ideas or issues we should be addressing, please let us know. Make sure you join our mailing list so that we can hound you relentlessly. And that's it. Thank you so much for coming.